Police reform sweeping the nation from Atlanta.
It is clear that we do not have another day, another minute, another hour.
To New York City.
Make no mistake, this is a seismic shift in the culture of how the NYPD polices this great city.
To an announcement from the White House. A closer look at what these calls to de-escalate really mean.
And then, I don't know, you can call me a snitch if you want to.
A shocking recording of police dispatchers released as the investigation into the death of George Floyd expands. And the Los Angeles County Sheriff changes course in the handling of a black man found hanging from a rope in a park. A suicide or foul play?
This death investigation obviously is of great concern to the community.
Right now on Law and Crime Special Report, Keeping the Peace. It's Tuesday, June 16th, 2020. Good afternoon. My name is Bob Bianchi. This is a special report on the Law and Crime Network, Keeping the Peace. Boy, it's been something else out here. The Atlanta mayor now issuing new directives with regard to police reform. What? Where have you been? Let's take a look.
Specifically, these reforms must comply with state law concerning the use of force, and they will include addressing APD's officers' response to resistance, generally and specifically regarding the use of deadly force in accordance with the principle that officers should use only the amount of objectively reasonable force necessary to successfully protect themselves or others, to effect an arrest or to bring an incident under control when dealing with members of the community, suspects, detainees, etc. Also requiring de-escalation generally and specifically prior to the use of deadly force in accordance with the principle that officers should use de-escalation techniques to gain voluntary compliance and avoid or minimize the use of physical force, and to continuously develop, update, and train officers in de-escalation techniques. Also requiring the reporting of all uses of deadly force by a police officer to our Citizens Review Board, adopting and implementing a duty to intervene, whereby if a police officer sees another officer using force which is beyond reasonable under the circumstances, that they are duty-bound to intercede and prevent that use of force and must immediately report the use of such force to an on-duty supervisor, and also provide lawful restrictions on when an officer may use deadly force toward a suspect who is in a moving vehicle.
Vikas Bajaj, he's a criminal defense attorney out in San Diego. Sir, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay, I hope you're safe. Listen, I got to be honest with you. I have an assistant prosecutor position when I was younger. I became a civil rights and criminal defense attorney. Then I became the head county prosecutor. This is nails on a chalkboard to me, sir. The first and foremost thing, these are patchwork, Band-Aids. This is ridiculous that they're at this point talking about these minor reforms. Let me start what I, sir, think is the biggest reform and problem, and I've stated it to governors and people across the country, and no one listens. Get people in office that make policies that have criminal defense, civil rights, and prosecution experience. All three of those facets are necessary. Why are they not doing that? Why are they doing patchwork? Why are they waiting so long? And do you think these reforms are truly effective? Or, my last point, sir, and you can go on anything I say because I'm going on a rant. How about a computer red flag warning system where it's centrally located with the Attorney General's office so that problematic officers are flagged early? And you know what that does, sir? It not only protects the community, it could protect an officer's career. Thoughts?
Absolutely. I'd agree with every one of those. I would say now with the executive order that we're listening into to see when it's actually going to be explained to all of us, the citizens of the U.S., it is a collaboration. We heard from the lawyer on behalf of the George Floyd family, who was part and parcel to the creation of this executive order. So for the first time, we have involvement from people on all sides. And Bob, you hit the nail on the head. Unless you have your finger on the pulse of the community, unless you've been in criminal court or civil court in a civil rights case, you don't understand the biggest hurdle to litigating these cases, which is, as you may know, and you do know, Bob, is getting the disciplinary records of the police officers that are involved. Now, not only is there going to be a collaboration with all three facets that you announced earlier, but I believe that for the first time, we're going to have the ability for defense litigators in criminal court, as well as civil litigators like yourself in civil rights actions in state and federal court, to have a blanket authority to be able to obtain disciplinary records. That means excessive force, lying on officer reports, and things of that nature. As you may know, different states have a labyrinth of statutes that we need to make our way through. How do you find the records regarding what we would call a bad cop? Well, it's a labyrinth, it's a maze, and it's designed that way in order to maintain the sanctity and employment of these officers. What we have now is the executive order should establish federal funding for a federal database. That means Officer Friendly in Minnesota would be able to not come on over to California without having the entire jacket or the history of that officer being readily accessible by any litigator that has a case or cause. So is it enough, Bob? I think at this point it is getting us to the point where we would be able to have an adequate framework to address these issues. It should also be noted that while police officers go through the academy, both federal and state, it's important to know the lack of training when they're dealing with individuals who have a psychological disorder, mental incapacity, a drug or alcohol addiction problem. And these are the cases that in many times give rise to claims of police brutality or excessive force. So for the first time, we have legislation by this executive order, which may see its face in actual legislation that can address these issues. So it's not just, 6 hours of drug recognition to be called an expert while you're testifying in court. These are educational forums for the entire platform.
Yeah, listen, I agree with everything you just said. I love the idea of transparency of records. I can't count how many times as a civil litigator I was in court, 10, 15 times, trying to get information about the officer's prior record that was being withheld. But here is the thing I also wonder. I agree with all your points, but we also have to make sure that internal affairs, instead of being the lowest rung of the organization in the police department, becomes the highest rung. And I can tell you, as having been the prosecutor that managed 44 law enforcement agencies, you have to have the most skilled, the most seasoned, and the message has to change from law enforcement, the public, and the mayor. And because I think these politicians are also demoralizing the police department. And that message should be that we want to give you those rules. We want to give you the guardrails. We want to give you the training. And if you're problematic, maybe you have an addiction issue, a mental health issue. Because what I know from the expert testimony in the civil rights world is that the experts tell you that most of these officers are a problem because of the custom, practice, and culture, as you know, under civil rights 1983 litigation, those are the standards of the police department. The police department is encouraging it. Thoughts?
Well, I'd agree with that. And the only time we have any type of a dissection of a particular police department in whatever jurisdiction may be at issue is when we may have, for instance, a grand jury who's been impaneled by the federal government to investigate claims of police brutality, excessive force, or lying or fabricating police reports. So perhaps the resolution is to have this federal funding appoint sort of an independent seeker of information when these IA claims are brought up. As you astutely point out, and it is so difficult to explain to people unless you've actually tried to get records on a law enforcement officer.
I know. I'm sorry.
As you know, it's impossible. It's difficult. It's very, very hard.
Yeah.
And part of that,
Unfortunately, I agree with you completely. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we got so much to cover here at the Law and Crime Network and on this special report. The New York City Police Department actually disbanding its plain clothes unit. Let's take a listen.
It is regarding the deployment of precinct level and PSA level anti-crime units. These are the plainclothes units that operate our traditional anti-crime. Effective immediately, we will be transitioning those units, roughly 600 people citywide, into a variety of assignments, including Detective Bureau, neighborhood policing, and other assignments. Why? This is 21st century policing. Intelligence, data, ShotSpotter, video, DNA, and building prosecutable cases. It continues to be building these cases on a small number of people that unfortunately still terrorize parts of this city. However, the key difference, we must do it in a manner that builds trust between the officers and the community they serve. I started speaking about a number of reforms that have just recently been passed. Make no mistake, this is a seismic shift in the culture of how the NYPD polices this great city. It will be felt immediately throughout the 5 district attorneys' offices. It will be felt immediately in the communities that we protect.
Okay, we got about a minute and a half to talk about this really quick subject before we take a break. Bajaj, let me ask you a question. Now I'm going to go on the opposite end of this. And I can tell you this is a person that used to be able to have to protect these communities. I am concerned that we're going to get to a point where we thin it out so much, we lose our intelligence-led policing dynamic, that trust me when I tell you, if crime rates start to spike, they're going to blame the police for not doing the interdiction that keeps the community safe. I understand it's a difficult balance. I look at this as a political move. Thoughts?
Well, I'd agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, the biggest fear for any community member is the lack of uniformed police officers in their community. How these law enforcement officers conduct themselves is the issue. Getting rid of them completely is a statistic I don't think we want to see the result of, and we will in a couple of months, to see the types of violent crime and property crimes we've seen. It's an absence that I don't think we as a community can afford, frankly.
Yeah, listen, it is a difficult balance. There's no question about the fact that you have to be able to have effective law enforcement and you have to make sure that they're being managed properly. The way that culture changes is by saying to the police, internal affairs and things that save your career so you don't wind up in the position that these other police officers are. Building trust within that community is so important. Guys, we're going to take a really quick break here at the Law and Crime Network. On the other side, we're going to come back with more fascinating stuff because we are keeping the peace. Hi, I'm Bob Bianchi. This is the Law and Crime Network special report, Keeping the Peace. Back to the George Floyd case. We're going to find out it's going to come trickling out now is a dispatcher tape. I want you to listen to it and carefully for one word that I think is important. Take a listen.
Hey, this is Jenna with Channel 1. Hey, what's up? Hey, so just wanted to let you know about the person with a knife at 2602 Bloomington. And then, I didn't know, you can call me a snitch if you want to, but we have the cameras up for 320's call. Oh, did they already put him in the, they must have already started moving him. And 320 over at Cup Foods.
Okay.
I don't know if they had used force or not. They got something out of the back of the squad, and all of them sat on this man. So I don't know if they needed you or not, but they haven't said anything to me yet.
Yeah, they haven't said anything. This is just a takedown, which doesn't count, but
Okay.
I'll find out.
No problem. We don't get to ever see it, so when we see it, we're just like, well, that looks a little different. All right, thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Sounds good. Bye.
All right. I'm not sure if I'm hearing that we don't have the guest, but what we did hear there was a situation in which the dispatcher in that case is reaching out. Now, apparently they have a video that they're listening to and watching, and they're actually reaching out to his supervisor. The word I wanted you to listen to was the word snitch, because like we were talking before with the other guests, this is really endemic of a kind of culture that goes on. And listen, I am a police supporter. You guys all know that have watched me on the Law and Crime Network. But there is that subculture of a concern that if you either say something about another officer or if you intercede with a superior officer, as you see there with the officers that are now being charged with regard to the actual death itself, then you are somehow breaching that thin blue line. And if there is one bright spot that I see in the Floyd case at all, this horrible, tragic, unnecessary death, is going to be the fact that there's going to be accountability now for those officers that observe it, see it, and don't do anything about it. And that is a huge police reform. And I think the use of these cameras and the citizens that were filming and this dispatcher that's talking to the supervisor saying that something bad is going on is going to be the very thing that is going to lead to a lot of that hiding, stopping in the police culture from those good officers who are afraid for their own lives that should they not support. And I know we have Brian Buckmire with me right now. He's jumped in as my guest here, which I really appreciate, because there is so much pressure on them. And they're told, if you're not with us, if you're not on our side, and by the way, this is an equal opportunity offender, whether you're a white officer, a black officer, whether, regardless of your race, that you're not on the team, that can literally pose a safety risk to you personally. Brian, I think the best thing in the Floyd case that's going to happen is that these officers now know you are as responsible as the person actually committing the violent offense, and you have an affirmative, now we know in theory you have an affirmative obligation, but now they're going to start seeing the real life consequences of what happens when you don't intercede. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. I think there's one thing to see it on the books. It's another thing to see it actually enacted. And you would know this as a former prosecutor better than anyone else. It's not until you start enforcing the laws, regardless of against police officers, firefighters, nurses, lawyers, everyday people, you've got to enforce the laws to ensure that people are on notice that they cannot break them in the future.
You know, Brian, I want to ask you this point. I've been wanting to ask you because I love your opinion on these things. But, you know, having done the job of enforcing internal affairs and law enforcement, having been a civil rights litigator myself, look, I think a majority of cops are doing the right thing. But what they're under the civil rights law, you have to prove a custom practice or pattern of deliberate indifference within the culture of the department. And what I notice is that the internal affairs units are considered the bastard child, if you will. You know, sorry if that's a bad term. They're second rate. They're filled with inexperienced officers. There's a lot of transition in and out. When I was prosecutor, I used to say to the, for my reforms, and we did significant reforms, including red flag early detection warning systems with problematic officers. And when they balked at that, my point was, look, this is a job protector. This is to help you. It's not like we're looking to hammer you. If we can get you, if you have an addiction problem, if there's excessive absenteeism, if there's an alcohol issue, if there's a mental health issue, let's get you there to treatment before you wind up before a grand jury. Why can't that be done universally around the country? Why can't these politicians stop pandering, waiting to the last minute, and put an effective uniform system in place? There are people out there like myself and others who know exactly how to do it, but they don't seem to have the guts to do it until there's a calamity. I'm sorry for going off. Thoughts?
No, but Bob, but you're listing the numerous amounts of ingredients that are necessary to get to that point. You need a Bob Bianchi. You need someone who has your gutso, but also your intelligence and your drive to do what you're saying. If you don't have that at the forefront, these things don't happen. You have to have a police union that is strong and can protect the employees they're looking after, but not so strong that they can bully politicians or politicians as well, just local governments, to say, hey, we want X amount of dollars. We want to be able to do A, B, and C, and you can't review us. I mean, New York passed a law that now that their disciplinary records can be now shared with the public. That's one step. We need to have this information. We need to be able to hold them accountable so that we don't have to wait till things hit the fan and we can have those systems you're talking about in place and actually working.
Brian, if I told you how many motions I have made in civil rights cases trying to get internal affairs records, and it becomes the big myth. Well, if you have a basis to let us know, and we'll provide some. Oh, you got a couple? Well, now we need more. I've literally been in one civil rights case where I made 20 motions to get the police officers' internal affairs records, which is crucial for a 1983 civil rights claim. So that is really a huge difference, so the public can start making its own assessment as opposed to having to rely on law enforcement. I got to ask you, this Robert Fuller case out there hung on a tree is another one, second individual within 45 miles that was hanging from a tree declared a suicide. I'll tell you why this agitates me, Brian. Agitates me in a good way, because I'm a peaceful man. You know that. But here's the thing. Every single unattended death is a murder case. That's how I ran it. It is a murder case unless you can prove something else like accidental death or suicide. My staff was so keen on not saying the S word, they would call it the S word in front of me, until they had solid proof that an unattended death was actually something other than a murder. Now, come on. You have two black men hanging from a tree by a rope with the history that we've had in this country, I don't know what the determination is going to be. They don't know what the determination is going to be. An autopsy hasn't even been concluded there, and yet they're not even working together in tandem to say there's been two in a couple of days in a close proximity to one another. What's happening, Brian?
I see this as them hoping that this goes away as quickly and as quietly as possible. Because as you unpack it, Bob, you see that there are so many levels here. Why wasn't this investigated in a way that we can all talk about in a very common sense way? I think that the police department there was fearful of the backlash that this will have, because no one's going to believe at first glance that a person, yet alone an African-American person who understands the concept of being lynched, is going to commit suicide in that very specific way. That boggles the mind. That doesn't seem like something that this person would do. You would go into checking about that person's mental health history, their connection with the community. I mean, Bob, you know this better than anyone else in terms of how you investigate a death and see whether or not there's motive for a homicide or whether it's a suicide. But doing it before the coroner's report, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, and Brian, you have to, again, go back with experienced people, and these are experienced law enforcement officers. And I would say to myself, if this ever happened to me and it didn't, a black man, and in particular, I'm saying a black, typically I don't like to make distinctions between races when I'm investigating crimes, but a black man hanging from a rope on a tree is a suicide. How many of those, Bob, in 30-something years of your career have you seen? And the answer would be 0. Okay, so now I'm in a fever pitch, and I don't understand. I get your point. I don't disagree with it. But if you want to have the public have confidence in you, then you let them know that you've done a full-scale, dot the I's, cross the T investigation after an autopsy is done, after potential witnesses have been had. And by the way, you mentioned a point on your show before, which is so true. After you tried to pull videos and get all the evidence you can, because as time goes on, the case is harder to investigate, then you can go to the community, I've done it, and say, this is what we did to try to investigate this, and we have no leads other than this. And I may not even say it's a suicide. I may say it's undetermined. Last point, Brian, this is the problem that happens when you have medical examiners and police that are on 2 different pages.
Exactly. And to your, I think part of the problem is, Bob, you are operating on a basis, and this is what I tell a lot of prosecutors and former prosecutors that I respect, and you're in that category. You are a respectful person based on that position. There are some who occupy your job or others who are not as respectful. And so while you're concerned about how the police interact with the community, that's because you're the right guy for this job. There are some people who don't care about that.
All right, buddy, you got the last word. Thanks for being here.